Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking some seriously provocative source material, stuff that attempts to literally deconstruct the very foundations of Western history. We're embarking on a deep, forensic, and psychological analysis into the origins of Christianity. We're going to look strictly at what happens when scholars apply modern historical and psychological lenses to ancient texts.
It brings up this massive question. What if the narrative that shaped the last 2,000 years of civilization was originally a desperate practical cover-up that eventually morphed into a global empire? The sources we're examining today propose a really radical hypothesis. They suggest that by rereading the biblical text strictly as historical and political documents, we uncover a hidden narrative of bloodlines, geopolitical survival, and a massive inherited psychological trauma.
Here's our roadmap for this journey. First, we'll look at a new historical paradigm. Then, the secret bloodline. Third, rewriting the crucifixion. Fourth, the deicide trauma. And finally, graduating from history's trauma.
Starting with Section 1, a new historical paradigm.
Now, what's really interesting about the Orthodox tradition is that it gives us this very clear, familiar picture, right? Jesus is born of a virgin and belongs to the royal line of David. But the source material we're looking at presents a starkly different historical hypothesis. They suggest the conception was entirely biological and the father was actually a high priest named Zechariah. This is a total game changer because it radically shifts Jesus from a royal lineage over to the priestly line of Aaron. Let's look at how the texts actually back this up.
Moving on to Section 2, the secret bloodline.
So according to the Gospel of Luke, immediately after the Annunciation, Mary hurries off to the remote mountain home of priest Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth, staying for exactly 3 months. Well, our sources treat this detail like a major forensic clue. Think about it biologically. A 3-month stay aligns perfectly with hiding the delicate first trimester of a pregnancy. That is the exact window when a pregnancy becomes physically undeniable. The hypothesis here is that this was a geographic escape to hide an unexpected pregnancy.
But why go to such lengths to hide it? Well, because the stakes were literally life and death. You see, in first century Palestine, an unwed pregnancy wasn't just some local gossip or a social scandal. Under Deuteronomy law, it was considered a crime punishable by death, specifically death by stoning. So, according to this historical paradigm, Joseph stepping in to claim the child wasn't just a noble romantic gesture. It was a desperately practical legal cover-up. It was a necessary lie to save both Mary and her unborn child from execution.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the whole narrative reshapes itself. If priest Zechariah was actually the biological father, then John the Baptist and Jesus were half-brothers, right? It makes complete sense of why Jesus had such incredibly precise insider knowledge of the temple's corruption, because he was born right into the priestly class. It also frames Jesus taking over John's followers not as some random event, but as a direct family succession of a religious movement.
Which brings us to Section 3. Rewriting the crucifixion.
So our sources point out this glaring historical discrepancy regarding the timeline. Modern historical analysis suggests Jesus actually began his ministry around 35 CE and was crucified in 38 CE. Do you see the problem there? Pontius Pilate's reign ended in 36 CE. The governor in power in 38 CE was a man named Morales. The argument here is that Pilate was conveniently blamed for one simple reason: he was dead. He couldn't defend the historical record, and that marks the beginning of a calculated massive falsification.
Here is the 3-step geopolitical alibi the research maps out. Step 1. The Roman Empire undeniably executes Jesus for treason, using their signature punishment, the cross. Step 2. The early church is trying to survive and expand within that very same Roman Empire. They absolutely cannot worship a known Roman insurgent. They have to exonerate Rome. So Step 3. To pull this off, the blame is violently and systematically shifted away from Rome and onto the Jewish people. It was pure political survival, and it eventually allowed Christianity to become Rome's state religion.
The culmination of this text manipulation lands in the Gospel of Matthew, with the crowd allegedly shouting, "His blood is on us and on our children." The sources we are exploring highlight this specific rewritten text as the tragic, engineered justification that fueled 2 millennia of devastating anti-Semitism, pogroms, and ultimately the Holocaust. It's a sobering example of a political edit having catastrophic real-world consequences.
That leads us into Section 4, the deicide trauma.
The key term to understand here is deicide, literally the killing of a god. Imagine the crushing psychological weight of that.
First on the early disciples who abandoned their leader, and later on the European empires who fully saw themselves as the cultural successors of Rome. Deep down in the collective subconscious, there was this terrifying realization: our ancestors cruelly executed the very entity we consider divine. It created a collective trauma of unimaginable proportions.
Those early followers desperately needed a way out of this psychological collapse. Let's see how this builds. The sources argue that the Apostle Paul provided the escape hatch by completely reframing the trauma. He took a miserable Roman execution and spun it into a cosmic salvation story, what's known as penal substitutionary atonement. In this new version, he didn't just die, he died for our sins. This brilliant paradigm shift turned a horrific historical crime into a divine, intentional sacrifice.
But that ancestral guilt, it definitely lingered in the West. The sources propose a fascinating theory that centuries of relentless, life-risking global missionary work by European empires was at its core a form of collective therapy. It functioned as a massive unconscious psychological defense mechanism. The idea is, if they could just convince the entire world that this execution was actually a global salvation plan, they could finally absolve their own deep-seated ancestral deicide guilt.
Let's move to Section 5, Graduating from History's Trauma.
Now, the point of all this analysis isn't to sit here and judge our ancestors. Not at all. It's to diagnose and heal a 2,000-year-old wound. So the crucial point the source material makes is this profound spiritual synthesis. If the divine spark is inside everyone, then a human being is essentially a developing God. Framed that way, the crucifixion wasn't just Rome killing a man, or humanity killing a deity. It was God killing God. It was a chaotic, incredibly painful, but entirely necessary step in the spiritual evolution and maturity of humanity itself.
And the sources beautifully connect the spiritual insight with the hard truths of modern physics. At a quantum level, the boundaries between us literally dissolve. I am you and you are me. When we truly realize this interconnectedness, the entire need to point fingers across history, whether at the Romans, the Jews, or anyone else, just completely falls away. We are all part of the exact same evolving fabric.
By looking objectively at the political survival tactics, the hidden human stories, and the collective guilt that shaped our past, we can finally start to let it go. So, the big question is, are we finally ready to graduate from this 2,000-year-old trauma? Are we ready to drop the historical blame and step forward, together, into universal healing? Think about that as you reflect on the incredible journey we've just mapped out. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.
What if the foundational story of Western civilization was actually an intricate political cover-up designed to hide a scandalous bloodline?
Right, a complete rewrite of the narrative.
Exactly. Like, what if the narrative we've been handed for 2 millennia was specifically engineered to exonerate a massive empire from a high-profile political assassination?
And that's the big question, isn't it?
It is. And what if the last 2,000 years of global history, I mean, the wars, the expansions, the shifting borders, were essentially just a global-scale collective therapy session, one that was meant to treat an ancient, unacknowledged trauma? Welcome you, the listener, to another deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one.
Today, we are opening up a massive, incredibly complex stack of academic and psychological hypotheses regarding the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth, the origins of Christian doctrine, and, well, the invisible psychological forces that quite literally drew the borders of the modern world.
But before we go a single step further, we absolutely need to establish the ground rules for the territory we are about to enter today.
Yes, very important.
The sources we are unpacking contain radical, fundamental deconstructions of traditional religious narratives. We are strictly acting as your guides to this specific academic and psychological material.
Right, and it is absolutely critical to state right up front that we are not endorsing these theories. We are not taking sides on any religious, theological, or politically charged viewpoints.
Not at all.
We know how deeply personal and sensitive this topic is. Our mission today is simply to explore the compelling what-if arguments presented in these texts. We're essentially acting as an impartial lens, mapping the territory of these hypotheses without demanding that anyone move there.
Exactly. It's an exploration.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to start with a biological and historical re-examination of the Nativity. Then, re-examine the timelines of the trial and the crucifixion, uncover the political mechanics of early biblical texts, and end with a really profound deep dive into the trauma of deicide that arguably drove global history.
Well, the best place to start is by stripping away 2,000 years of supernatural interpretation. We just need to look at the text as a raw historical document.
Okay, let's do it.
The sources we're examining propose what they call the Zechariah hypothesis. They argue that the biological father of Jesus wasn't the Holy Spirit, but a human man, specifically the high priest Zechariah.
Wait, Zechariah?
Yes, and the evidence they use to build this argument isn't some hidden forbidden scroll. It's actually right there in the Gospel of Luke itself.
Okay, so let's look at the sequence of events Luke lays out, because when you read it with a purely biological lens, it describes a very recognizable human crisis.
It really does.
According to the text, upon receiving the Annunciation, Mary doesn't stay in Nazareth. She immediately packs up and rushes off to the remote hill country of Judea, to the home of her relative Elizabeth.
Right, and we have to understand the geography and the cultural context here. Traveling from Nazareth to the hill country of Judea is roughly an 80 to 90-mile journey.
Which is huge back then.
Exactly. For a young woman in the first century, this is not a casual weekend trip. It is a grueling multi-day journey. It's often dangerous, requiring travel with a caravan. You do not make that journey suddenly unless there is a profound, urgent catalyst.
You'd need a really good reason to just drop everything and go.
Precisely. Now, Elizabeth is married to Zechariah, who is a high priest and the patriarchal head of that household. And the text in Luke specifically notes that Mary stays there for exactly 3 months.
3 months. If we connect this to the broader picture of human biology, that specific duration of time is highly, highly significant.
It's the magic number.
It aligns perfectly with the first trimester of pregnancy. That is the exact window of time when a pregnancy transitions from being a secret you can theoretically hide to a physical reality you absolutely cannot hide from your community.
Right. The biological reality of the first trimester involves morning sickness, extreme hormonal shifts, and eventually, well, the physical presence of a baby bump.
You can't conceal it forever.
No, you can't. The theory suggests that during this time or leading up to it, Mary conceived a child with Zechariah. And to conceal this deeply illicit, unauthorized pregnancy from her local community in Nazareth.
Which was a really small, tight-knit village, right?
Exactly, a village where everyone knows everyone's business. To hide it, she fled to the mountains. She stayed hidden in a remote, highly protected aristocratic household until the first trimester passed, and only returned when the situation had to be dealt with publicly.
I want to pause here and talk about the stakes of that situation. Because to a modern listener, an unwed pregnancy might just seem like a social scandal. Like, you get some bad looks at the market.
Right, maybe some local gossip.
But in first century Palestine, under the strict interpretation of the Torah, we aren't talking about local gossip. We are talking about a capital offense.
It was a matter of life and death. Under the laws of Deuteronomy, specifically chapter 22, an unwed pregnancy or a betrothed woman conceiving a child by another man was a crime punishable by death.
And not a quiet death either.
No, death by stoning, often right at the door of her father's house. The stakes were absolute survival. If Mary's pregnancy is discovered by the public in Nazareth before a legal shield is put in place, she and the unborn child face a brutal execution.
Wow. So if we look at the character of Joseph through this biological lens, it completely reframes his historical role.
It changes everything about him.
He's usually depicted as this passive, quietly obedient figure who just accepts a miraculous explanation. But in this hypothesis, Joseph accepting Mary was essentially a life-saving legal maneuver.
Yes, a calculated risk to save her.
It's like an ancient witness protection program for a vulnerable mother and child. By stepping in and legally claiming the child, he shields them both from the lethal force of the law.
He provides the ultimate legal cover-up, and the authors of these texts argue that the later church had to fiercely protect the doctrine of the virgin birth and brutally suppress any dissenting views, not simply to elevate Jesus' divinity.
Then why?
They had to suppress it, because the alternative, that the founder of their religion was an illegitimate child, was a political and social scandal that could have destroyed the early movement entirely. In the Roman and Jewish contexts of the time, pedigree was everything.
But I'm looking at the timeline and the implications here, and this raises a massive question. If Jesus is the biological son of the high priest Zechariah, that completely rewrites his social status.
It changes his entire cultural DNA.
Right. He's no longer from the royal lineage of King David through Joseph.
And this brings us to the second major paradigm shift of these sources, the issue of priestly bloodlines and sibling succession. Traditional doctrine places Jesus firmly in the royal lineage of David, tracing back through Joseph's ancestry.
Which is what everyone is taught.
Right. But if Joseph is only a legal shield and Zechariah is the biological father, Jesus belongs to the priestly line of Aaron.
Which means he's an insider. He's not some peasant outsider throwing stones at the elite establishment. He is fundamentally part of that establishment's world. Let's unpack what it actually meant to be from the priestly class in first century Jerusalem. It wasn't just about reading scrolls, right?
Not at all. The priesthood in ancient Judea was the aristocracy. They were the political brokers, the wealthy elite, and they basically controlled the central economy.
So they had real power.
Absolute power locally. The temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was essentially the central bank of the region. It held massive wealth, controlled the currency exchange, and managed the incredibly lucrative sacrificial economy.
So if Jesus is from this priestly line, he is born into this specific socioeconomic tier.
Exactly. And that explains one of the greatest mysteries of his later ministry. Think about his profound, intimate knowledge of the Jerusalem temple.
When he goes in and flips the tables of the money changers.
Yes. He isn't just acting out of generic spiritual outrage. He critiques its structural corruption, its economic exploitation, the hypocrisy of the priestly class, with the precision of someone who knows exactly how the internal machinery works.
Because he grew up around it.
Right. When he refers to the temple as my father's house, under this hypothesis, he wasn't speaking entirely metaphorically. He meant it quite literally.
Oh, wow. That's a huge shift.
The temple was Zechariah's workplace. It was his official residence while he was on duty serving his rotation. Jesus would have grown up with a deep insider understanding of how the religious establishment functioned and how it was corrupted by its collusion with Rome.
There's another domino that falls here, and it's a big one. If Zechariah is his father, and Zechariah is also the father of John the Baptist, that makes Jesus and John the Baptist brothers.
Or at least half-brothers, depending on how you view the familial structure of Zechariah's household at the time.
It completely recontextualizes their relationship. In traditional history, John is the forerunner in the wilderness who baptizes Jesus, a sort of spiritual mentor who recognizes the Messiah and passes the baton.
That's the standard narrative, yes.
But under this bloodline hypothesis, we are looking at a familial dynasty. We are looking at a coordinated political and religious movement run by two brothers from an elite priestly family.
It's a completely different power dynamic.
But wait, the traditional timeline has them born only 6 months apart. Does this hypothesis change that?
It shifts it dramatically. The sources suggest a revised chronology to support the historical markers found outside the Bible. They propose John the Baptist was actually born around 6 BCE during the reign of Herod the Great.
Okay, so a bit earlier.
Yes, but they argue Jesus was actually born significantly later, around 8 CE.
Wait, 8 CE? That's like a 14-year age gap. Why move the birth of Jesus forward by over a decade?
The sources anchor this shift to the census of Quirinius. The Gospel of Luke explicitly ties Jesus' birth to this specific census. Historically, we know the Roman census under Quirinius happened in 6 to 8 CE.
So there's a hard historical date for that.
Exactly. It occurred when Rome deposed the local ethnarch, Archelaus, and turned Judea into a direct Roman province. This wasn't just a head count. It was a hostile tax audit by an occupying empire, and it sparked massive, bloody local rebellions.
These people were furious.
The sources argue this implementation in the Galilee region aligns with 8 CE, placing Jesus' birth right in the middle of severe anti-Roman political upheaval.
Okay, so John is the older brother by over a decade. Jesus is the younger brother. How does this play out in their adulthood? If John is running the movement, what triggers Jesus stepping onto the public stage?
Well, according to the timeline in these sources, John is executing a massive, charismatic, and politically dangerous religious movement. He is gathering thousands of followers, baptizing them in the Jordan.
Which itself was a subversive act, right? Bypassing the temple's official purity rituals.
Exactly. It was a direct threat to the temple's authority.
Oh.
Eventually, he becomes too much of a threat and is arrested and eventually killed by Herod Antipas around 35 CE.
Right.
It is exactly at this moment, right after John's death, that Jesus suddenly begins his own public ministry.
So it wasn't just some spontaneous spiritual awakening in the desert, it was a succession plan. The charismatic leader is assassinated by the state, and his younger brother from the same priestly bloodline steps up to take over the organization.
It's a very raw, very political sequence of events.
It really is.
It becomes a highly organized passing of authority. It grounds the origins of the movement in historical logistics rather than sudden mystical appearances.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, though, because if you're telling me he's from this elite priestly line, an insider with the pedigree to take over a massive religious movement, why does all of human history remember him as a poor carpenter from the backwater town of Nazareth?
It's a fair question.
I mean, that completely contradicts the idea of a high priestly heir. If he's elite, why the woodworking?
It's an excellent point of friction, and the sources clarify this by looking at historical economics and the translation of the original Greek text. They argue that Joseph's primary profession was not carpentry at all.
Really? Then what was it?
Well, the Greek word used is tekton, which generally means builder or artisan. But the sources we are looking at today argue that in the specific rural economy of Nazareth, Joseph's main source of income was as a shepherd.
A shepherd. Wow, that feels like a massive pivot from the story we're used to.
It is. In the ancient agrarian world, being a shepherd involved long periods away from home, moving flocks across varying elevations to find grazing lands depending on the season. It's a nomadic, incredibly time-consuming job.
So he wasn't just sitting in a workshop all day.
Exactly. During the off-season, when the flocks were penned or didn't need extensive grazing, Joseph would return to Nazareth and work a secondary trade to make ends meet. He was a tekton, a builder or carpenter, as his off-season side hustle.
Oh, that makes so much sense, because the people of Nazareth only saw him when he was in town during the off-season working with wood or stone. So they just assumed, oh, that's Joseph the builder.
Right. They defined him by the work he did when he was geographically present in their village.
And this shepherd reality makes the famous nativity scene suddenly snap into this pragmatic focus. I mean, why was Jesus born in a cave or a stable? Because Joseph was out working his primary job, grazing sheep, and Mary traveled with him.
Yes. In the ancient Near East, shepherds often used natural caves as temporary shelters for themselves and their flocks.
And who are the first people to arrive at the birth? The shepherds, his co-workers, his colleagues in the field.
It completely removes the mystical coincidence of random shepherds wandering in following a star and replaces it with a deeply logical, historical scenario.
They were just the guys on the same shift.
The people working the night shift in the same grazing territory came to help their co-worker whose wife was going into labor in a field shelter.
I love that. It takes the entire aesthetic of the Nativity, which we usually treat like a magical, sanitized diorama, and turns it into a gritty, pragmatic reality of ancient gig work and agricultural life.
It makes it incredibly human.
It does. So we have a radical reinterpretation of his birth, his bloodline, and his early life. But the sources argue that the most massive, world-altering cover-up surrounds his death. Let's look at the mechanics of the crucifixion and the timeline surrounding it.
This is where the historical records face severe academic scrutiny. Traditional history places the crucifixion somewhere between 30 and 33 CE, under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate.
Right.
However, the sources we are examining claim that the execution actually took place later, in 38 CE.
But wait, if it's in 38 CE, Pilate is out of the picture.
Precisely. Pilate's term ended in 36 CE. He was recalled to Rome by the Emperor Tiberius after violently mismanaging a Samaritan uprising.
So he wasn't even there.
No. By 38 CE, Tiberius is dead, Caligula is emperor, and the governor of Judea was a man named Marullus. Yet, if you search the historical records, Marullus is practically a ghost. His records are mysteriously wiped from Roman history.
Which is incredibly suspicious, right? Because the Romans were obsessive record keepers. They cataloged every tax coin, every legionnaire's pension, every minor provincial dispute.
They documented everything.
To have a governor just missing from the ledgers implies an intentional deletion, a damnatio memoria, the damning of memory.
It strongly implies a massive institutional cover-up. And if you are an early Christian writer trying to assemble an official narrative decades later, why blame Pilate instead of Marullus?
Because he's an easy target.
The simple answer is, dead men tell no tales. Pilate died or disappeared into exile shortly after his term ended. If the later editors of the story needed a Roman figure to attach to the narrative without risking political pushback from a sitting governor or a powerful living patrician family, a dead, disgraced former governor is the perfect silent scapegoat.
Let's stop right there, though. Why cover it up at all? What actually happened on that cross that necessitated rewriting history and shifting the timeline to hide the real governor?
The sources introduce what is often called the swoon, or survival hypothesis. To understand this, we have to look closely at the medical mechanics of crucifixion.
Okay, let's get into the dark details.
We have this image from art that crucifixion kills by blood loss from the nails. But medically, that isn't true. Crucifixion was a method of execution designed to kill via slow asphyxiation.
Right. Because of the way the arms are stretched out and nailed, the chest cavity is pulled open into a permanent state of inhalation.
Yes. To exhale, the victim has to push up on the nail through their feet, bending their knees to relieve the tension on their chest, allowing the diaphragm to release.
Which sounds unbearable.
It is, because pushing up causes excruciating pain in the feet, so they slump back down. It's a torturous seesaw between breathing and pain.
It's basically an agonizing marathon of breathing. Every single breath requires a conscious, pain-inducing physical effort.
And because of this, historically, a healthy person could survive on a cross for days, sometimes 1 to 2 weeks.
Weeks.
Yes. They would eventually die of hypovolemic shock, dehydration, or utter muscle exhaustion, where they simply lack the strength to push up for one more breath. Now look at the timeline presented in the gospel texts. Jesus was a healthy young man, roughly 30 to 35 years old.
Right.
Yet, according to the accounts, he was on the cross for a matter of hours, half a day at most.
Medically speaking, a few hours just isn't enough time for crucifixion to do its lethal work on a healthy adult male.
That is the core of the medical argument here. He is taken down before sunset due to the approaching Sabbath, where Jewish law required bodies not to be left hanging overnight.
So there was a hard deadline.
Exactly. The hypothesis argues it is highly probable that he merely swooned. He entered a profound state of traumatic shock, syncope, or a comatose state from the pain and trauma, but did not biologically expire. He was taken down while still alive.
I'm looking at this from a logistical standpoint. If you know how the Romans execute people, and you know it takes days to die, and you suddenly have a tiny window of a few hours to be on the cross before the Sabbath forces the Romans to take you down, it almost sounds engineered.
Engineered how?
Well, if Jesus wanted to survive, he would need an inside man. He would need someone handling the logistics behind the scenes.
An inside man. Who are you suggesting?
Judas Iscariot. Think about it. Judas is the ultimate traitor of Western history. But what if we completely flip his role based on this text? What if Judas wasn't a traitor at all? What if he was the ultimate fixer?
That's a bold claim.
We always hear about the 30 pieces of silver as his payment to betray Jesus. But what if that silver was actually a bribe that Judas paid to the Roman guards?
A bribe for what, exactly? What could he possibly buy from a Roman execution squad?
A bribe to ensure Jesus got a footrest on the cross. The Romans called it a sedile. It was a small block of wood attached to the main beam that the victim could rest their weight on.
Right, the sedile.
It wasn't an act of mercy. It was meant to prolong the torture by delaying asphyxiation. But if Judas bribes the guards to install a sedile, he extends Jesus' survival time significantly. And more importantly, he uses the rest of the bribe to ensure the guards take him down early, declaring him dead to Pilate or Marullus when he was merely unconscious.
Knowing the Sabbath deadline was approaching.
Exactly.
That is a staggering reframing. It turns a story of ultimate greedy betrayal into a story of ultimate desperate loyalty. It suggests a highly orchestrated survival plan that went incredibly, dangerously wrong, resulting in massive physical trauma.
But he survived.
Yes, but medically left room for what the followers would later interpret as a literal resurrection from the dead once he recovered in the tomb.
Okay, but if this was all a political maneuver, if Rome executed him or tried to execute him for treason against the state, how in the world did Rome eventually become the global headquarters of the religion that worships him? I mean, the Vatican is in Rome. The Pope sits in Rome.
It is the greatest public relations pivot in human history.
It really is.
It requires an unbelievable historical rewrite. And to understand how they pulled it off, we have to examine the Roman alibi and the shifting of blame. We have to start with the stark legal reality of the ancient world. Crucifixion was strictly, exclusively a Roman punishment.
Right. It was their signature move. The Jewish authorities didn't use crosses.
Yes. And the Romans didn't use it for common thieves. It was a highly visible, state-sponsored terror tactic reserved for very specific crimes. High treason, terrorism, sedition, and armed rebellion against the empire.
It was a message.
A very clear one. The Jewish punishment for religious crimes, like blasphemy or breaking the Sabbath, was stoning. Therefore, the historical fact that Jesus was crucified is undeniable, objective proof that Rome unequivocally executed him as a political enemy of the Roman state.
Let me stop you there. Because if you read the Gospels today, Rome doesn't come off looking like the bad guy. Pilate looks like a middle manager who is just trying to keep the peace and is forced into a corner by an angry mob.
And that is where the textual analysis of these sources shines. If you trace the Gospels chronologically, meaning in the order they were actually written, not the order they appear in your Bible, you can actually watch the political editing process happen over time.
So the story changes.
Dramatically. The
Yeah.
earliest Gospel is Mark, written around 70 CE, right around the time the Romans brutally crushed a Jewish rebellion and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem.
So the author of Mark is writing in an environment where Rome is on high alert, slaughtering anyone who looks like a Jewish rebel.
Exactly. The political temperature is boiling. In Mark, Pilate is relatively cold, calculating, and ruthless. He acts like a Roman governor. He sentences Jesus with minimal hesitation. But as time goes on, the narrative changes.
How so? What's the shift?
By the time you get to the Gospel of Matthew, which is written 10 to 20 years later, the character of Pilate has been drastically transformed. Suddenly, Pilate is agonizing over the decision. His wife is having prophetic dreams warning him to let Jesus go.
Like he's the victim of circumstance.
Yes. Pilate is convinced of Jesus' innocence. He literally washes his hands of the execution in front of the crowd, declaring himself guiltless. And the Jewish crowd is depicted as a bloodthirsty mob, screaming the infamous line in Matthew 27:25, "His blood is on us and on our children."
His blood is on us and on our children. I mean, that single sentence has caused so much suffering. It is arguably one of the most destructive sentences ever written.
It is the foundational text for 2 millennia of anti-Semitism. It has been used to justify pogroms, inquisitions, and the Holocaust. But according to these academic sources, we have to ask why it was written. What was the motive for this massive theological shift of blame?
It's survival, pure and simple. If you are an early Christian in the 1st or 2nd century, you are living inside the Roman Empire. You are a minority.
And a vulnerable one at that.
Right. If you run around the streets of Ephesus or Corinth preaching, hey, come worship our God, and by the way, your government executed him as a state terrorist,
Yeah.
you are going to get crushed. Rome will wipe you off the map for spreading sedition.
Precisely. The early Christians needed an alibi to survive. They could not openly worship an enemy of the state. So the early editors of the movement created a political spin to make their religion palatable to Roman authorities.
They changed the villain.
Exactly. They said Rome was innocent. The Roman governor tried to save him. It wasn't a political rebellion against Caesar. It was an internal religious dispute, and the Jewish authorities forced Rome's hand.
They shifted the blame from the actual executioner, the empire with the legions and the swords, to a convenient, politically vulnerable scapegoat. They threw their own people under the bus to survive in a Roman world.
And when the Roman Empire actually adopted Christianity as its state religion under Emperor Theodosius in 380 CE, this PR spin became absolute, institutionalized truth.
Because they couldn't be the bad guys in their own religion.
Exactly. The empire could not be the murderer of its own god. The scapegoating of the Jewish people became a theological necessity to protect the psychological and political integrity of the Roman Empire.
But here is the thing that trips me up. If this was a cover-up, how do you stop people from pointing out the truth? There had to be people who remembered the real history.
Of course there were.
There had to be other letters, other gospels floating around that said, actually, Rome definitely did this, and Jesus was a political rebel. How do you enforce this new sanitized version of history across an empire that spans from Britain to Syria?
You enforce it through strict, uncompromising censorship. This requires us to look at the process of canonization and the deletion of history.
Because it's one thing to write a new book, it's another thing entirely to make sure no one reads the old books.
To maintain these constructed narratives, the virgin birth that hid a scandalous priestly bloodline, the shifting of the crucifixion timeline, the exoneration of Rome that hid a political assassination, the newly empowered state-backed Roman Catholic Church had to establish a strict canon. The canon is the official list of approved books.
The ultimate VIP list of ancient texts. If you aren't on it, you don't exist.
It was far more aggressive than just a librarian's reading list. Anything that contradicted the approved narrative was labeled apocrypha or heresy. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and dozens of other accounts were systematically hunted down.
They didn't just ignore them.
No, the scrolls were burned, and anyone found possessing them or teaching from them was persecuted, exiled, or executed.
So it's like an ancient empire-wide non-disclosure agreement enforced by the military might of Rome. Canonization wasn't just a group of scholars organizing a reading list. It was the imperial authorities hitting the delete button on historical evidence that threatened their political stability and their newly adopted theology.
That is a highly accurate way to describe the mechanics of it. The Council of Nicaea and subsequent councils were as much about political consolidation as they were about theological purity. And what adds a fascinating layer of credibility to this idea of systemic falsification is that it isn't just a modern secular critique.
What do you mean?
If we look outside the Western tradition, Islamic theology actually holds a core concept called tarif.
Tarif. Unpack that for us. What does that concept entail?
Tarif is the Islamic concept that the original teachings and revelations of Jesus, the true gospel, or the Injil, were intentionally distorted, altered, and corrupted by political factions within early Christianity.
So they believe the texts were tampered with.
Yes. Islamic scholars argue that the texts were altered to introduce concepts like the Trinity and to align the religion with Greco-Roman paganism.
So the Islamic scholars looking at this from the outside centuries later were essentially saying, we agree with Prophet Jesus, we revere him, but the books you guys are carrying around have been politically doctored by Rome.
Yes. It is an external, centuries-old validation of the idea that text tampering was systemic. The early church didn't just organize history, they curated it, sanitized it, and violently destroyed the outtakes.
Deleting text is one thing. You can burn a papyrus scroll. You can execute a heretic.
Yeah.
But how do you delete the psychological guilt of murdering a deity?
That's the real challenge.
You invent a new theology. This brings us to what I think is the absolute climax of this entire deep dive, the deicide trauma and the psychology of Christendom.
This is where we move from historical logistics and political maneuvering into the realm of deep intergenerational psychoanalysis. To understand the psychological forces at play, we have to start with the immediate aftermath of the crucifixion.
Right after he's arrested.
Exactly. When Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, the text is brutally clear about what happened next. The disciples fled. They abandoned him.
The ultimate failure of loyalty. They didn't stand and fight. They ran.
It was a mind-shattering trauma. They believed this man was the Messiah, the one who was going to liberate them from Rome and save the world. And instead, he was arrested, humiliated, and tortured to death on a Roman cross, and they left him to die alone.
The psychological guilt of that abandonment would have been absolutely paralyzing. How do you live with yourself after that? How do you look your family in the eye?
You can't, unless you change the meaning of what happened. You have to find a way to make it so that you didn't actually fail.
You need a psychological out.
Exactly. You utilize a profound psychological defense mechanism. Enter the Apostle Paul. Paul is a fascinating historical figure because he never actually met the living historical Jesus.
He wasn't even there.
No, he wasn't in the garden. He didn't flee. Yet, Paul is the architect of the theology that would ultimately cure the disciples' trauma.
How did Paul cure it? What was his theological solution?
He invented what theology calls penal substitutionary atonement.
Okay, that's a dense theological term. Let's break down exactly how that works for people who aren't familiar.
It is the idea that the crucifixion wasn't a tragic political failure. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a victory for Rome. Paul argued that Jesus had to die.
Like it was predestined.
Yes. He died specifically to pay the penalty for the sins of humanity. His death was a blood sacrifice demanded by God to balance the scales of cosmic justice.
Oh, wow. So if I'm Peter, or one of the other disciples, sitting in a dark room in Jerusalem, paralyzed by the guilt that I abandoned my best friend to a Roman torture squad, Paul comes in and says, "Stop crying. You didn't fail him."
Your running away didn't matter.
Right. This was the divine plan all along. His death wasn't a murder. It was a cosmic transaction to save your soul.
It is the ultimate cognitive reframing. It takes a miserable, agonizing political failure and transforms it into a divine gift. The guilt is instantly alleviated.
Because it had to happen.
In fact, under this new theology, trying to save Jesus from the cross would have been the wrong thing to do because it would have interfered with God's plan for salvation.
That is incredibly powerful. It completely neutralizes the trauma. But how does that localized trauma of 12 guys in Judea scale up? How does a coping mechanism for a few disciples become the driving force of global Western history?
Because the trauma scaled up with the empire. Remember, the Roman Empire adopted Christianity. They became the official sponsors of the religion. Eventually, the Roman Empire fell, but white European society arose from the ashes, claiming to be the civilizational, cultural, and spiritual successors of the Roman Empire.
Right. The Holy Roman Empire, the monarchs of Europe, they all took on the mantle of Rome.
But by taking on the mantle of Rome, they unknowingly inherited a massive subconscious burden. Because if they are the successors of Rome, they are the successors of the empire that murdered the Son of God.
The term is deicide, the killing of God. The psychological burden of that, the ancestral intergenerational guilt of our civilization killed the divine, is intolerable.
It would break a culture's collective psyche. You cannot build a confident, expanding civilization on a foundation of ultimate cosmic guilt. So, how did Western Christendom deal with this deep, unconscious trauma?
They leaned into Paul's reframing. They took that localized defense mechanism and made it universal. They made the whole world buy into the cure.
The sources argue that the centuries of fanatical, relentless, and often violent global missionary work by Western powers, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the colonial expansion into the Americas and Africa, was not merely about spreading peace and love.
What was it about then?
It was a massive, unconscious, collective therapy.
That completely flips the script on world history. You're saying that the age of discovery, the colonial expansions, the obsessive, sometimes violent need to convert every single indigenous person on Earth, it was a compulsive trauma response.
Think about the psychological logic underlying it. If they could force every person on Earth to believe that the Roman crucifixion wasn't a murder, but rather a glorious gift of salvation for all mankind, then their ancestral guilt is pardoned.
The crime is erased by universal consensus.
Exactly. If everyone agrees it was a rescue mission, then Rome isn't guilty of deicide.
It's like saying, we didn't murder him, we facilitated a universal rescue mission. And to prove it, we're going to make sure every human on the planet agrees with us.
Because if anyone disagrees, the illusion breaks.
If anyone rejects the narrative, the defense mechanism fails, and they are thrust back into being the descendants of God killers. That is awe-inspiring. A psychological wound, an unhealed trauma dictating the borders, the wars, and the beliefs of the modern world.
It shows how history isn't just driven by economics, territory, or resources. It's driven by ghosts, by the things we refuse to look at in ourselves, the shadows in the collective unconscious.
And this is where we need to introduce a really profound angle to all of this. We promised the listener we would look at how this ancient history connects to some very modern concepts.
Yes, the intersection with modern science.
We've talked about deicide, God killed God. But if we look at this through the lens of modern physics, specifically concepts like quantum entanglement, or the idea that consciousness is a fundamental, non-local, unified field.
The idea that separation is an illusion. That at a fundamental quantum level, the observer and the observed are part of the same fabric.
Right. The I am you and you are me truth that modern physics keeps hinting at, and that Eastern philosophies have taught for millennia. If that is true, then humanity itself is an expression of the universe experiencing itself. Human equals a developing God.
That is a profound synthesis.
Yeah.
Because if human consciousness is an expression of the divine, then the trauma of the crucifixion isn't just about a political empire killing a historical prophet.
It's much deeper.
It is the trauma of a species violently rejecting a part of its own divine nature. God killed God. We harmed ourselves.
And that explains the depth of the trauma. If we are all fundamentally connected, if separation is a myth, then committing that kind of brutal violence against one another leaves a psychic scar on the whole species.
We feel it collectively.
We've spent 2,000 years running from the guilt of that scar. We've pointed fingers at scapegoats, rewritten history books, burned scrolls, and tried to conquer the globe to make ourselves feel better about the violence we inflicted on our own reflection.
But the beauty of mapping all of this out, the historical realities of the Zechariah hypothesis, the political cover-ups by Rome, the psychological defense mechanisms invented by Paul, is not to lay blame. It is not about pointing a finger and saying, Western society is the villain.
No, not at all. It's the exact opposite of blame.
It is about diagnosis. You cannot heal a trauma until you acknowledge it exists and understand where it came from. If humanity has been acting out of a 2,000-year-old trauma response, understanding the raw, vulnerable, deeply human origins of these stories is the only way we can finally graduate from that guilt.
We can stop running. We can look at the Roman politics, the frightened disciples, the desperate cover-ups, the shifting of blame to the Jewish people and say, okay, that was our messy, traumatized past. We were scared. We were trying to survive.
But we don't have to keep acting it out today.
Right. It's an invitation to collective healing.
It is the realization that the divine wasn't something separate that we broke on a Roman cross, but something inherent in us that we are learning to integrate. We can lay down the psychological burden of deicide because we finally understand the historical mechanics of the illusion.
What a place to land. Let's recap this mind-bending journey you, the listener, have just been on. We started by stripping away the supernatural to look at a terrified young mother hiding a biologically real pregnancy in the Judean mountains to escape a lethal law.
We uncovered a priestly bloodline that reframed a rural carpenter as an elite insider, taking over his brother's massive political movement.
We examined the medical realities of a Roman cross, exploring the mechanics of asphyxiation and opening the door to an engineered survival facilitated by Judas Iscariot.
We watched the early editors of the Bible shift the blame from a powerful Roman Empire to a vulnerable Jewish minority to survive, creating a scapegoat that would suffer for centuries.
We saw the Roman Catholic Church use canonization as an empire-wide delete button to protect their PR.
And finally, we tracked how the unbearable guilt of a failed movement and a murderous empire birthed a theology of substitution, driving centuries of global conquest as a desperate form of collective therapy.
It is like finding out the skyscraper you've been living in is built on a massive fault line, but instead of being terrified, you realize you now have the blueprints to actually fix the foundation.
And I want to leave you with one last thing to ponder. We spent this time looking at how a 2,000-year-old trauma resulted in censorship, scapegoating, and profound guilt on a global scale.
It's heavy history.
But think about your own deeply held narratives, your own personal history. How much of what we believe to be objective truth in our own lives is actually just a psychological defense mechanism, beautifully engineered to protect us from a reality we were too afraid to face?
If an entire civilization can rewrite history to avoid feeling guilty, what histories are we rewriting in our own minds every single day?
The question worth carrying with you.
Thank you so much for joining us on this intense intellectual exploration. Keep digging into the bedrock and keep asking the big questions. We will see you on the next deep dive.